I'm making is that tax administrations now have to cast a wider dimension, to the subject of transfer pricing. And I recall two experiences, personal experiences, being on the UN Committee of Tax Experts that work on the UN model, where the preoccupation years back when I was on it was transfer pricing. And then chairing the Financial Intelligence Committee for my country, where the focus had changed now to bringing in the monetary authorities, the central bank, and banks were represented because they were interested in illicit flows that were going, because it also involves what? Capital flight, right? Over-invoicing, under-invoicing. Over-invoicing of exports, for example, means that you can take more money out than the actual value of the goods. And then under invoicing of imports means payment of less taxes under declaration. So that brings us back, even though the monetary authorities are interested from a capital flight perspective, money taken out illegally, the focus remains customs, because customs manages the exports, customs manages the imports, besides, services, particularly of goods. And so you see that even in the complexity, customs administrations still, have a role to play. Our tax institutions still have a role to play. The point I'm making being the dimension is broadening. And therefore, as we will come to see in our risk management, we are not just looking at the issue of tax evasion and tax avoidance and looking at loopholes that are exploited. We are beginning to look at, a wider dimension of the issue. And therefore, the tax authorities do not only have to be tax officials, particularly the research, monitoring, and senior officials, not interested in tax evasion and avoidance only, but they have a common interest in illicit movements of funds, in money laundering, and most of the cases that are dealt with in money laundering. We know the famous Al Capone case in the U.S., where it used to be only the U.S. IRS could, help indict, Al Capone. It means that through the financial transactions, they are able, customs and other transactions. So our interest is beginning to widen, and coordination with the tax authorities has become an issue. Now, these are some estimates. It is estimated that developing countries are losing 1.6 to 2.2 trillion US dollars from, these are calculations by the by the Global Financial Integrity, through drug trafficking, illegal logging, human trafficking, and then illegal mining, illegal wildlife trade, crude oil theft, small arms, light weapon, organ trafficking. So you see and illegal, and income that is what? Illegal, right? So you'll be indicted for, illegal activity, but also for evading and avoiding the tax that's related to this. So what is the risk management dimension? So where traditionally the risk management that we embed in our systems and processes, and these days we have, risk management units, is moving beyond just an issue of tracking tax evasion and avoidance. It is being integrated with security, national security systems, and is being integrated with monetary systems. And this is where, there is an added responsibility. For many of our institutions, we do not even have, the fundamentals, the rudimentary, controls that are needed to check these activities. And these dimensions are being added. And as, there's a rich menu of topics that are going to be discussed, from digitization through, other strengthening of tax systems and processes. As we go through the next, 2 days to be discussing these points, the point I want to make is that our function as tax administrators is moving beyond the narrow confines of tax, administration, and tax, policy. So the standard, we can use standard or off-the-shelf and other issues. I wouldn't spend my time because those will be the subject of my discussion. There's a lot of discussion on digitization. But the point is coordination and then a proactive approach, which must be used to tackle these issues. Tackling them after the fact, often makes it difficult. And I make two propositions mainly, as I conclude. The first one being some of the developments, within tax reforms help, the discussion with some of the points that I've just made. First of all, the creation of revenue authorities is bringing together the databases, organization, and processes of customs administration and domestic tax administration. And therefore, we should see that as, where previously it was difficult, to the databases, the common compliance where we use customs information, for example, to enforce domestic taxes and vice versa, is a good opportunity for us to begin to use to look at these things. Secondly is the segmentation. We have been embarking on segmentation. I know KRA is involved in it. Large taxpayer units, medium taxpayer offices, or small taxpayer offices. Sometimes it's large taxpayer offices and medium taxpayer offices. Recall where the conversation started, it dealt with multinational corporations. And these are also our clients in terms of large taxpayer, office operations. So again, I'm drawing attention to the fact that we should not see the control of either transfer pricing, illicit movement of funds and money laundering as alien. They should be embedded in the structures that we are putting in place. Then obviously there is automation. Everything is being automated, including the monitoring of manifests, way bills and others, movement of goods, physical inspection, random, obviously, not a 100% inspection. All these are becoming relevant, but relevant not just for what we do. Of course, we need to also get our large taxpayer units well informed, in transfer pricing rules. I make a point, also in stating that some revenue authorities should begin to develop, on a higher plane, some African revenue authorities, especially the pioneers, like KRA, TRA, GRA, Ghana Revenue Authority, with, say, SARS, in the lead. It has always been in the lead, to make sure that the principles of taxation and policy, tax administration and policy, are embedded in our training and other programs. I have attended several workshops, both as a tax practitioner, as minister, as I'm doing now, where the discussion remains very basic and fundamental. What I'm proposing is that we need a maturing of some of our institutions, like KRA, TRA, URA, GRA, and the rest, some of which are becoming middle-income countries, or are supposed to be managing the tax administration for middle-income country. Ghana has become a middle-income country. Projections are that it will never be reversed. I presume KRA and others are, if not there, they are already heading there. So we need mature tax administrations. And mature tax administrations mean we should not be preoccupied with principles that will be taught to people who are entering, say KRA. That should be a given. Tax policy should be, we should stop the debates on what is a VAT structure. Do we need flat rate VAT? Do we need, those are given. Often we use it to dilute the tax structure, only to come back again with expensive technical assistance, to come back to, ground zero. If we embed this as professional practices within KRA, within URA, within TRA, I think it will be difficult. And I've been a politician now. It will be difficult for politicians to tackle with, some of these things. Then, KRA, for example, I envisage with a strong training institution or within an EAC, KRA, URA, and TRA, Rwanda Revenue Authority, creating a very strong tax institute where the tax administration, TA, will be provided to the institution for training of subordinates. training of people who are moving to supervisory grades, and training to managerial grades, so that we can use expensive TA to build capacity, so that we can tackle the increasing dimensions, for example, of transfer pricing. Otherwise we would remain, very basic. And this is a challenge, maybe going into KRA's 4th, 5th tax dialogue. How do we create mature, tax institutions in Africa, particularly the countries that are becoming middle income and with resources? I think we should move away from being infants or babies, and begin to take the lead, so that we can direct the IMF, World Bank, and other, technical assistance, to 2 areas. One, coming to develop curriculum for transfer pricing for our institutions to teach, others, not, a subject of technical assistance for a small unit, let's say within a large taxpayer unit. And then the second dimension of technical assistance and of capacity building will focus on specialization, the areas of specialization. I think it is possible for some revenue institutions to break out. And in this regard, we can also have the assistance, frankly, of even, the big 4, KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and the rest, HRMC, USIRS, who have built this capacity to turn attention to building this type of capacity. So in conclusion, I'd like to just emphasize that what used to be a major UN OECD activity, transfer pricing, is now having a wider, dimension. We must move towards engaging our businesses, our clients. For example, beyond beyond transfer pricing, where it is about auditing, to advanced pricing, so that there will be certainty even in tax administration. I'm not yet familiar with any of our African countries that has evolved even basic advanced pricing rules, which is used by the advanced countries to engage these same multinationals, so that we are not, working, after the fact. And let me repeat the point again in summary. Let us also create mature revenue administrations, in Africa. I have 30 years, of practice, and in my intervention, maybe in the afternoon, I'll draw attention to why I believe that, we should be moving in this direction. Thank you very much.
I would like us to really put together our hands again for Seth Emmanuel Tekpa. In traditions of events like this, people are introduced normally before they speak. But I would like to introduce to you the person who just spoke. For those who may not know, Seth Emmanuel Tekpa is a chartered accountant and former Minister for Finance and Economic Planning of Ghana. He served, if I'm right, under President John Dramani Mahama. And he's a chartered accountant. He's also a member of the board of directors and the joint steering committee of the Ghana Revenue Authority and the Ghana Integrated Financial Management Information Systems. And if I could just pick one thing that he said right there, he did paint a very clear picture of where else the problem lies. It's not just about tax evasion or avoidance. There is also what he's calling illicit financial flows, which indeed is the subject of our panel discussion this morning. And at this point, I now want to introduce the moderator for this morning's session. That is Gareth Harrison of PricewaterhouseCoopers PwC. He leads us down a discussion on transfer pricing and illicit financial flows. And with him, for those who are late during this introduction, we do have George Abel. I'll just ask you again to show your hand, please. That is George Abel. Let's clap for him. Let's clap for Nikhil Hira of Deloitte. And we also do have Emily Muya, who is from the IBFD government consultancy. Now, over to you, Gareth. lead us in this conversation. Please use the microphone next to you. I hope the handheld free, right there, yes. On the tables next to you, you'll have a microphone, and let's get down to this. Let's welcome Gareth Harrison with a warm round of applause. Use this one? Yeah.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first session of this year's Tax Summit. And I'm really delighted that we've managed to bring together a panel of great expertise and experience on the subject of transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is one of those rare tax subjects that escapes out of academia and professional circles and makes it onto mainstream media. And particularly for the African revenue administrators, a lot has been written about the impact of transfer pricing on revenue collection and the impact on, therefore, fiscal expenditure through transfer pricing. So there is a lot written about transfer pricing. There are also a lot of, I think, misconceptions that circulate around transfer pricing, and hopefully we'll go some way to dispelling some of the misconceptions and also bringing some light onto some very important issues that are particularly relevant to Kenya at this time. So with that in mind, thank you, Seth, for your presentation this morning, which I think has provided a very valuable overview of the topic. What I'd like to do now, Nikhil, is ask you, if I may, to sort of put transfer pricing into a Kenyan context for us, and what do you see as some of the key issues for Kenyan transfer pricing?
Morning. I'm sorry, my voice is not quite as loud as everyone else's here, so I'm going to need this. Morning, Gareth. Thank you for the introduction, and Seth, thank you for your presentation. So transfer pricing. Well, let me just start by saying that transfer pricing in itself is not illegal. What is illegal is mispricing or deliberately ignoring the rules, laws, regulations that have been set up in the jurisdiction that you're resident in. So generally, transfer pricing to me would fall into tax planning and avoidance as opposed to out-and-out evasion. And I think it's important to appreciate that we can plan our affairs to minimize our tax liability, provided we do it legally. Clearly, if we're doing it illegally, and the result is an illicit financial flow, then that is an issue. And I think that's where the focus needs to be. Not necessarily on the legal use of transfer pricing, provided your prices are not deliberately mispriced, and that you are actually complying with the local laws and regulations. I think the second point I'll make is that it's important to understand that transfer pricing in itself is not an exact science. What I believe is a correct transfer price, George here is almost certainly going to say isn't. That's the nature of the beast. We're sort of on opposite sides of the fence, as it were. Indeed, within his own side of the fence, a transfer price that he might accept, his colleague in the customs department may not accept. If you think about it, they want it higher in customs, George wants it lower. So the whole thing of transfer pricing is very inexact. There are going to be times when we're going to have to agree to disagree, and maybe have to take it to the next level. But agreeing to disagree doesn't necessarily mean that something illegal has happened. And I think we need to move away, not just in Kenya, but in many parts of the world, to me, we need to move away from this attitude that the multinationals are deliberately setting a transfer price with the view to reducing tax take in the country they're in. It does happen, there's no doubt about that, and we've seen instances of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a whole-scale, widespread problem that we have. And even if you look at our law in Kenya, Section 85 of the Tax Procedures Act has now brought in penalties for a tax avoidance scheme, which is double the tax payable. So the focus seems to be too much on the multinational is guilty, and I think that's something that we need to move away from, because it's not necessarily the case to me. But the bottom line is transfer pricing in Africa, in the developing world, is a very, very emotive issue. There are always going to be, there's always going to be this feeling that almost as though the imperialists are back, the colonists, the colonial times are back, they're taking money out of the country, which they shouldn't. But we need to look at a wider picture also. We need to appreciate that multinationals coming into our regime do contribute to the tax stake. They do contribute to the economy in a big way with increased employment, excise duties, value-added tax, customs duties, etc. So it's not all a one-way street, and I think that's an important point to bear in mind. But for this to work, we need detailed and fair rules and a fair administrative process, which I think Seth mentioned this morning as well. We need to strengthen, and I know for the Kenya Revenue Authority has gone a long way to doing that. But it is an evolving problem that needs to continuously evolve and continuously become stronger and stronger if we're going to deal with this fairly. Thank you, Darren.
Thank you, Nikhil. Okay, so we've heard there from an advisor, a practitioner who advises their clients about transfer pricing. Allow me to move, George, to you as an administrator, a transfer pricing expert within the KRA, and now also you sit on the UN Tax Experts Panel. You and I have sat in your office. I have represented a taxpayer, a multinational taxpayer, and we've discussed this issue many times over the years. So tell me, from your perspective, transfer pricing is very much a cross-border issue, and how, as KRA, are you seeking to strengthen partnerships in order to facilitate knowledge and information transfer that is relevant? And how do you see Kenya's tax treaty network forming part of that initiative that KRA are undergoing?
Thank you, Garrett. Thank you for that question, and thank you for a very good presentation. I think maybe my points will be a little bit divergent from what Nikhil has said, but that is okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. First of all, just to begin to set it up, from tax administration, there are clear things that we are seeing that was not making sense. One, for example, if I give an example, is that why would you have a company, a large company, doing business in your country, year in, year out, and make losses through and through, and they don't see the reason why they should wind down. And when you ask what is the strategy with regards to how you're going to recoup, you don't get answers. So those were our concerns. The other concerns we got is that if you look at subsector, and if you look at small players, you see that they're making bigger margins. But the big player who is a multinational is making a smaller margin. So those are critical things. You're supposed to be leveraging on your large scale. So you're supposed to even be making more, but you're making less. So those started asking, playing in our mind, and we started saying, no, this has got to turn around. So from about 2009, we began then the journey of starting to look at these transactions critically, and I'll be at some point give you what we saw. But just to answer your question, I will answer it from two fronts. What are we doing internationally, and then what are we doing domestically? I think it's good to cut that diversion, because multinational problems is now cutting across all countries. The problem is not about developing countries alone. The problem now is also about the developed countries. So there's a lot of international things happening, and about three things I'd want to mention here, which are critical. First, under the OECD, came up with a global forum for transparency and exchange of information. It was found out that sometimes when information is not shared across, correct information, then these issues of transfer pricing is difficult to deal with. And so you see one side and you don't see the 3D of the taxpayer. You're not able to see how much are they making from the other jurisdiction. So it's good to see the entire angle of it. And from that Global Forum Exchange of Information, Kenya signed in. We've gone through the peer review, the first and the second peer review. And now we're just waiting to sign for the convention. There's an instrument called the Convention for Exchange of Information, basically. So once we sign that, we have signed already. When we have Parliament then ratify it, which we are hopeful that that will be done sooner than later, then we should then be able to get information. And mostly, the world has pushed the low tax jurisdiction countries to sign into this mark. So it means that we're going to get information about low tax jurisdictions like Mauritius. We get information from Dubai, UAE. We get information from Monaco and all these other places, because that information is important. It's important because even as taxes, even as income is moved away from Kenya, it's also moved away from those European capitals that these companies come from. So that information is going to be important. The second, which is a recent phenomenon, which is a very important phenomenon, is the base erosion and profit shifting. And the key in the opening address that was mentioned. In this BEPS initiative, what we call BEPS initiative, the G20 identified this to be a big problem. They identified that because they started seeing a pattern whereby multinationals now, if you look at capitalization, they are much bigger than countries. So they're going stronger, okay? And when you look at how much taxes they're paying, then you begin to have problems about it. So the BEPS initiative was driven by the G20, and Kenya signed in, and in that engagement, we are looking at all possibilities. We are coming up with rules, with the regulations, then that will apply. And all countries on single footing, they are looking at all these things together. And so how it works through working parties. And Kenya is involved in those working parties on benchmarking, working parties on digital economy, working parties on issues of double tax agreement. So all those ones are in place. And the rules will come, and those rules, once they're in place, then countries will be asked then to domesticate them. Once they domesticated them, then it means that you can then be able to start dealing with these issues much more effectively. The third one internationally is what we call the multilateral instrument. We call it MLI. What it means is that it was found out that the double tax agreements that are in place between countries, multinationals have found ways then to create gaps, to take advantage of gaps that are existing in those double tax agreements. So there are certain things that are being fixed. The one thing that is being fixed, about three things that are being fixed under the multilateral instrument, is issues with regards to treaty shopping. What it means is a country taking advantage of a treaty between one country with another country. So they go into, put a liaison office into one country so that they can take advantage of the treaty between that country and the other country by enjoying the low tax rates. That is being addressed. The other thing that is being addressed is issues of permanent establishment. And permanent establishment is a key thing with regards to tax. Why? Most countries are source-based. If you earn money from Kenya, then pay taxes in Kenya. But if you've got a multinational that do not want to characterize itself as having earned money from your jurisdiction using the law, then it becomes a problem. So that is being addressed under the MLI initiative. So those are critical things that are happening. The other thing is about arbitration. When issues come about, dispute resolution, we are looking at how we can then be able to fast track so that taxes can be collected. Now those are multinational. Domestically, there are quite a bit of stuff they're doing, but I'll pick about 4 only that are important. The first one is the review of domestic legislation. Currently, we're in the process of reviewing the Income Tax Act. So we are looking up to have a new Income Tax Act. And this has been a long process that the country has gone through. They have reviewed the excess tax, modernized it, simplified it. They have reviewed the VAT. That has happened. And now we've got the Tax Procedure Act. And the final one is the Income Tax Act. Now, looking at the Income Tax Act, we are making sure that these things that have happened internationally, critical things that are in place in that legislation, so that we have got good rules that then have got less gaps that can be taken advantage of. The second is KRA has invested in information technology, and we are getting to a point to leverage on. So we've got the iTax that you are familiar with, so that we avoid the manual process and information is there. But the system itself is intelligent. Intelligent because it can then be able to make comparison very quickly. It can make comparison on sector, it can make comparison on filings, and it can also check information that come from different sources. And so that for us, when we start harvesting the fruits of that, it means that our enforcement capacity will really be built with information that comes internally. And that goes about with something that we're calling data warehousing, that we expect to get bulk information in future. And bulk information is important. Bulk information that can then be able to be used to review the files, the tax filings. So that will turn around. The third thing is, which we've done, is to professionalize the team, the transfer pricing team. And we are proud of what we've done in terms of having a team that is effective, which can be able to deal with the transfer pricing. It's not an easy, tax area. So you've got to have a dedicated team, a team that is capable of dealing with these issues. And we have continually built the team. We've got, obviously, recognition from everywhere, key places. But we know that there's still room to be able to build the team further. We had initially a team of about 16, and now we've built it to 40. And so we've got people who are dedicated, people who can then be able to deal with this. The successes we have had is that we have dealt with about 65 cases currently, and from those you've collected up to about 25 billion over a period of 3 years. And that is good in terms of collection through enforcement. But we also are careful that once we do this, we also push compliance, because voluntary compliance has got a much greater effect. And so we are looking at those kind of possibilities. Now, the final thing we are doing around this, which I just wanted to mention domestically within the Kenya Revenue Authority, is to deal with the illicit cases that now requires a prosecution. And so what we've done is that we have got what we call Tax and Crime Initiative, which Kenya Revenue Authority has put in place with the OECD. Now, this is to increase capacity that the KRA has to deal with tax and crime. And there is a collaboration which lies around it. We call it the multi-agency team. The multi-agency team leverages on information that is collected through the National Intelligence Services. It also has got information that comes from the anti-corruption body. Also works very closely with the Office of the Prosecutor, and also works very closely with the Asset Recovery Office. So this multi-agency team come together and deal with tax and crime. And we are starting to begin to see the fruits that is going to give to us. So overall, we've got strategy around it. We think we are doing the best. Obviously, there's room in terms of improvement, and we always look out for what is outside there that is useful, that can be able to increase our capacity. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, George. That's a very comprehensive summary of the developments within KRA. So we've heard now from a Kenyan practitioner and a Kenyan revenue officer. Let's invite our other two panelists to bring to bear their own international experience. So Emily, if I may come to you first. George talked there about the BEPS agenda at OECD level. And obviously that's providing a lot of the context for transfer pricing discussions particularly. Perhaps you could give us sort of your experiences. You know, you look across sub-Saharan Africa for IBFD. What other developments do you see across the region?
Thank you, Gareth. Transfer pricing, and I will look at it principally from the BEPS perspective. I think we sort of all know how it began. I think Seth gave us a very good overview. But in terms of transfer pricing, the main focus actually was to ensure that multinationals were not separating profits from the activities that generated them. That's in a nutshell. And what Nikhil and George have said, both perspectives could actually play. And a lot of what has been happening then after October 2015 last year, when the final reports were issued by the OECD, is that the OECD then went on ahead to sort of consolidate the changes to the actions that dealt with transfer pricing, which were actions 8 to 10. And these have now been consolidated in the new guidelines that were issued in July of 2017, so this year. So there's essentially now new guidelines for transfer pricing purposes. And what has majorly changed, again, as I said earlier, are from action 8 to 10 is to again ensure that profits are reported where activities are undertaken. And there's a whole lot discussion of how to undertake transfer pricing studies, delineation of transactions, checking the risks, and a lot of dealing with commodity transactions, because it was again noted that this is one area that was very vulnerable to transfer pricing, mispricing, if I may use the word. And the idea around commodity transactions then is that the OECD has come up with a proposal which if many of you who have heard of the sixth method, which is mainly in place in Latin American countries. And the UN, I should say, has also adopted this thinking of the sixth method. So what this happens now, and I think for developing countries, Kenya certainly, that we deal with commodity goods transactions, then the idea is that with this sixth method, that the pricing of commodities has now been determined, sort of there has been a shift. Not so much a shift, because it was already there in the transfer pricing guidelines, just a lot more focus has been given to these sort of transactions. So that is the general overview for the transfer pricing bit, that the part where what has Africa mainly done, for most countries in Africa, what has happened, and I think most of you in Kenya would know, we have very short transfer pricing guidelines. I think earlier on we had mentioned it with Nikhil. It's just like 2 pages that says then that transfer pricing guidelines will be in line with the OECD transfer pricing guidelines, and that's it. So then what happens in situations where countries have such rules that sort of incorporate the OECD transfer pricing guidelines into their domestic system is a situation where we see that we now have new OECD guidelines, and the issue that has been majorly the questions we've had with multinationals that we've dealt with in the region in sub-Saharan Africa. The question has been, how will these countries then implement the changes to the guidelines? And my guess is as good as yours, that tax authorities will certainly take up the changes, the few changes that were introduced into the guidelines, and will be implementing them. For countries such as, I think, Nigeria, Malawi, which say that the OECD, the transfer pricing guidelines are premised on the OECD guidelines as revised from time to time, or the UN transfer pricing, practical manual on transfer pricing, then for these countries it's easier to sort of determine what will happen, because then the OECD guidelines have been revised, and for these countries it's easier then to say that the new guidelines will now be applied, as long as they do not contradict with domestic provisions. So for countries, mostly in terms of other action plans, so that's general OECD guidelines. In there we have the action that dealt with documentation and country-by-country reporting, and I think this has been the major focus for most multinationals, because this has been a totally new introduction of the country-by-country report. In terms of African countries, South Africa is one of the countries that has already implemented regulations, and I think the first exchange is already due, I think, next year. So we have South Africa. Gabon has also put in place certain domestic legislations to implement country-by-country reporting. Nigeria also has something in place. So those are among the African countries that have done something with the country-by-country reporting. There's something happening with these 3 countries. There could be more. But essentially what has happened with these countries is that some domestic legislation have been passed in one way or another to enable the implementation, sort of the incorporation of the recommendations of the OECD into their domestic situations. South Africa is certainly way ahead of all the others because it has completed all the processes now, I believe. And as I said earlier, then it is expected that the first reports will be exchanged soon, I think for the financial year beginning for January 2016. Malawi, I think, is interesting to note because I mentioned something, and I think Seth had asked the question on advanced pricing agreements. Some countries have these provisions in their legislations. We do not have it in Kenya, certainly. countries, I think Nigeria has it in its laws that the provisions on advanced pricing agreements. I think Ghana, not too sure. But what happens then is that there is still no advanced pricing agreement for transfer pricing purposes in Africa, none that I know of. And the African governments are still very reluctant to take on this concept of advanced pricing agreements. And for me, in my position, I think this is something that could be embraced by tax administrations, by governments in Africa. I think it has its advantages, which I believe in the long run could outweigh the disadvantages, because the main concerns I get when I talk about the issue of advanced pricing agreements with most African governments is the question that we do not have information, we do not have the capacity to enter into these agreements. But these are things that could be developed with time, because the capacity you develop to undertake a transfer pricing audit is the same capacity you'll be required to analyze a case to determine an advanced pricing agreement. More could be said of it, but I think it's a concept that could be welcome eventually. Malawi has also advanced pricing agreement provisions now introduced in its domestic legislation on transfer pricing, which was, I think, passed last year. And this is only for the mining sector. So some countries are now also beginning to introduce certain provisions that will take care of advanced pricing, of transfer pricing uncertainties. And we hope that with these developments, that Africa is certainly now forging forward to deal with transfer pricing issues. As George said, I should actually also mention it, that Kenya Revenue Authority, for most of the countries I've gone to, not just in Africa, Kenya Revenue Authority is highly regarded in transfer pricing matters. And I think this is something that we should all be proud of as a country. Of course, since I deal mostly with governments, they will give credit to another government agency. But this is not to say that the practitioners in Kenya do not have a part to play. They certainly have played a role in ensuring that KRA is up on its feet and is applying transfer pricing rules as is required internationally. I think with these few remarks, I will pass on to Gary.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Thank you. I'm sure the KRA people in the room would be grateful for your commendation of their progress. Seth, if I may just come again to you. We've heard I think a sort of domestic position for Kenya. We've heard a sort of comparative position for Africa. From your experience, your past experience as a revenue administrator and as a finance minister in Ghana, what were your main concerns when trying to deal with this, either through legislation or through interaction with taxpayers, or perhaps with international bodies like IMF, World Bank? What really were the key issues that you were trying to deal with, and how did you go about that?
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Having participated in many of these fora, listening to KRA is as good as listening to GRA. And it's not surprising, because the source of technical assistance, whether you're talking about OECD, you're talking about IMF, World Bank, are the same. Ghana's transfer pricing, rules, regulations, which is actually enacted as a regulation, in our case must go to Parliament, was actually drafted with the assistance of OECD. It needs to be upgraded within the new paradigm, which has just been mentioned. And so I think that, let me make 2 or 3 points. First, where is ETAF at the table? We talk about OECD, we talk about regional organizations and whatever. I think part of the capacity building across Africa, should involve, now we have a tax administration forum, which represents, tax administrations. I think it's acceptable. I think it's fair to say, and I stand for correction, that all the revenue authorities and administrations in Africa are members, of ETAF. ETAF organizes the tax research, network series. The last one was in Madagascar. I think this could provide, one of the, avenues for unifying practice in Africa. And let me go to advanced pricing let us tackle it even as a concept. As tax administrators, we may have our reservations. And as somebody who has sat like a KRA colleague here on the UN, Committee of Tax Experts before, I know where the reservation is coming from. In terms of information exchange. But today, as he indicated, we are signing multilateral agreements that involve the exchange of information under OECD or BEPS. That is, in itself, is some shifts in the positions of advanced countries, and I'll come to that, than what it used to be, 20, 15 years ago. And so, either as a concept, as a practice note, as rulings, these are when I talk about the maturing of revenue administrations, these are where the developed and developing or emerging countries, came from. We should dare to have rulings, we should dare to have practice notes, which are published, updated regularly, of course, where, abuses, it's not just abuse, let's also, think in terms of fairness to our tax, paying, community and those who represent them. That is also part of our work to make tax practice as transparent, and equitable as possible. So I would say, let's dare to look at advanced pricing because it is acceptable practice, even as a concept. Let ATRN, for example, through, ATAF through ATRN, research the topic, and bring together, minds like those who have had interaction or having interaction, within BEPS or other contexts as we have here, and have, a former Ghanaian colleague who is also on the committee. I think that we have, together with IBFD, and there are a lot of, who can bring the developing country or African perspective to bear. Otherwise, we are signing off and saying, it is as if it were an OECD regulation. Let's face it. And let me come back. It used to be, let me emphasize again, the source and the residence rule. Now we have consumers coming in. And part of the reason, and I agree with the point that was made, that the concern for multinational corporations is going beyond just developing countries. Now it's advanced countries that used to house the residents. And that's because they are seeing their tax basis in terms of even consumers who are consuming the product, but the tax base is going somewhere. And those are the things that are coming up. So I see BEPS in the middle. It's just a shift in continuum, where it used to be pure residence and source, as we used to debate at length at the UN Committee of Tax Experts, to profit sharing. There's a certain basis for profit sharing, which is the middle ground, which used to be, not to be entertained by many countries. So there is a shift. So I think a historical perspective would also put things in context, for African countries as we move along. There is a law that is coming out now, which I believe, we can benefit from the international community, but there is no substitute. And let me emphasize, there is no substitute to developing capacity internally. I think as the KRA official indicated, you need to develop capacity, auditing capacity. You need to, the comparable pricing and other rules are complex. You need to develop, that capacity. And therefore, that is the other context, for placing not all 33 or so sub-Saharan African countries, and it is not a matter of discrimination, but it's a matter of some countries advancing to become, as I said, middle-income country, some countries advancing in terms of capacity, and leadership, which is required by some of these institutions, is very important. Let me also emphasize that the issue is not just about multinational corporations anymore. It's also about individuals. The Panama Paradise Papers is showing clearly that tax avoidance, tax evasion is going beyond, just multinational or foreign companies. We are seeing the naming of individuals within our countries in some of the activities, which involves tax evasion and avoidance in some of these, papers, and documentation. And therefore, again, the dimension, as I pointed, as it moved to illicit flows and to money laundering is coming home. Because our taxpayer population domestically is becoming sophisticated, right? It's becoming, and through tax advice, tax planning, and you may want to have a little bit of reservation, put in some avoidance rules. It's necessary, but I think the problem is plugging loopholes. Plugging loopholes in the act, for minimizing the avoidance. So my final point, which I have, to make is to go back to the question of our regional organizations and our lack of strong continental body. I think ETAF is coming up, and within, say, EAC, within ECOWAS, within SADC, we need to strengthen. That's one of the, ways in which we can strengthen, capacity, hold arms, relatively weak and stronger administrations, but bring in the expertise that is required at these levels. And let us develop ETAF into the winsome continental body that it should be. We should be representing Africa at G20, at BEPS, and at other international fora. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you very much. It is interesting that you talked there about ATAF and the role that they have to play in the future. Obviously, the European Commission has taken on a much more robust stance with regard to corporate tax avoidance by multinationals, etc. So there is clearly, some international capacity building as well to do across the continent. But let me come back to this issue of the debate around tax evasion and tax avoidance, because the two terms often now, I think, get conflated as one activity. And as someone who's been a tax practitioner for 20 years, I've seen the development of this debate where there was a clear line in the past between tax evasion, which everybody accepted was illegal, and that was a criminal case, and tax avoidance, which would potentially involve you making planning decisions about how you structured your affairs in a way that was entirely legal within the tax laws of the jurisdictions in which you were operating. It strikes me that line is blurring very, very quickly, and Nikhil, you referred to the tax penalty in the TPA. That is a punitive penalty for tax avoidance. So I'd be interested to hear the views now of the panel on how we understand the tax avoidance and tax evasion debate, and where we see this subject matter, transfer pricing and illicit financial flows, fitting within that tax avoidance, tax evasion discussion. So Nikhil, maybe we can start.
Thank you, Gareth. I think I should start by saying, of course, that 35 years I've been an advisor, and tax planning is what gives me my daily bread. So this debate about avoidance and evasion has probably got a direct impact on how I'm going to earn my daily bread. I think you're right that when I first started practicing tax, there was a very clear line between what was evasion and what was avoidance. And the evaders were criminal, the avoiders were quite brilliant in their own way, because they managed to look at the loopholes. And I think the key point that I caught from what Seth was just saying was that as long as we have loopholes in our laws, people, and dare I say people like me, are going to be looking for them, so that we can minimize the tax liability that our clients, or indeed ourselves, have to pay. The difference today, though, is I think the world, has become smaller as we become a global village. At the same time, it's become more complex. The way you can move funds around the world today you couldn't do 35 years ago. And if you tried to do a wire transfer 35 years ago, it would probably take you a week to get the bank to understand what you're doing. And today you just do it on your cell phone. So it is so much easier for money to move around the world that I think illicit flow has become much bigger. So that line that we had 35 years ago, or even longer, is now gradually disappearing because people can actually see what is being done. And more and more countries are bringing in anti-money laundering legislation, anti-bribery acts. These things are out there. The media, the social media, everyone knows what is happening. When there's a scam, it spreads everywhere. Everyone knows about it. So I think we as people are seeing more of this, and the morality is now coming to question. And more people are saying, well, that's fine, but is it right that you shouldn't pay your fair share? And my argument has always been that you must pay your fair share, provided you're not breaking the law. I mean, you can pay less, provided you're not breaking the law. And I think it is critical, and George, your reference to rewriting the Income Tax Act, I mean, there is an act that we've had since 1973. It probably has more patches in it than Microsoft Office does. And it is such a complex piece of legislation for a country like ours that we are constantly having differences of opinion. So the need to consolidate it, make it clearer, bring in international best practice is now critical. And I think gradually we're going to see that avoidance evasion line completely disappearing as a result of that.
George, let me give you the right of reply there.
Yeah, thank you. I think you got it. This is a very difficult, because the line is blood. You said for sure the line is very blood. And as the world becomes complex, as it becomes a small village, you find transactions the way Nikhil has mentioned. It makes it easier for cross-border movement of money. It's very easy now. Even forming a company in another jurisdiction and trading in Kenya is very easy now. Strictly, when you look at the law, the difficulties we experience is that when it comes to evasion, you've got then to show that there was evidence of intention. That becomes difficult. Because then what evidence are you going to put together to show that there was intention to evade? That becomes difficult. So that is always a challenge. When you look at the law again strictly, if you plug one hole, another hole is taken advantage of tomorrow. So it's a very ongoing process. Because even as you try to make it as complex as possible in terms of covering all the loopholes, somebody out there is looking at it and seeing how best can I then be able to avoid this. I had a very interesting conversation one time. Somebody was saying that he's going to build a very nice yacht and he's going to stay there in the waters so that he doesn't become a tax resident anywhere. And he says he just makes sure that for 183 days, because that's the rule, he's out there in the water, and so he's not tax resident in any country. And people are thinking about that. So there'll always be, it's like you're chasing your tail in the room, so as you move, your tail keeps on following you. But what happens is that we keep on trying to plug those holes, trying to see whether we can be able to plug them and then have a conversation. The final one, which is always my challenge, and sometimes we have that conversation with Nikhil here. This domestic resource mobilization, the resources that we are collecting is for the public good. It's good for you we have good security, it's good for you to have good roads, it's good for us to fight issues of poverty eradication in our country, and we need resources. So if you've got the interest of the country, let's have a frank and transparent conversation. And we look at these adjustments and we make them based on the fact that our opinion is not very different if we are enjoying these public goods. And that now tends to move towards morality as opposed. But you see, we need to have that conversation because this country is for us all.
Thank you, George. I'd just like to add that neither Nikhil or I were involved in the yacht planning scheme. We didn't advise on that. Emily, this concept of morality within the context of being a taxpayer, do you have a moral duty to pay the right amount of tax, a fair amount of tax? What is that, the debate that you've been party to as IBFD?
Thank you, Gareth. I think the world is now changing to more like paying taxes based on morality. And I think it's not a very good thing. I believe that tax, its nature, is a very complex concept. And I think for the benefit of all taxpayers, it's important that there's a prescription of what should be paid, how it should be paid. And it's very difficult, even on a normal day-to-day basis, to rely on someone's conscience, to appeal to someone's morality. I think expecting that taxpayers will pay tax based on morality is it's a heavy expectation on the taxpayer. And it all comes, if we make taxation a morality issue, then you would see why it would not be many people compelled to pay taxes, I believe. I mean, morality is a relative concept. It really, at the end of the day, depends on what you deem moral or immoral. And I'm not sure whether paying taxes will be one of them. But as I said, there is a move towards, we see with the debate that has been going on globally with companies, big multinationals coming to public scrutiny because of how they pay taxes in which jurisdictions, very low taxes in very low tax jurisdictions. Then we see that companies at some point were actually forced to sort of pay taxes, pay something they did not believe that by the law they should have paid, but then they paid so that they appear to the public to be good. And as much as that happened, I don't think it's a good thing that we should expect that this will always happen. And the first step towards doing that is to ensure that we have the basic instruments, the systems, the processes to enable us to enforce tax rules. So we should have the law, we should have the systems, we should have the structures, and certainly the authorities, the regulatory authorities, to be able to rightly enforce tax laws so that we do not then make tax something that, should I appeal to Mr. X's morality for him to pay tax, let there be a clearly defined mechanism, and let there also, it's good that George mentioned the idea of public good because I had thought to mention it. I think if people can see what their taxes is going into, then it's easier to expect that people would pay tax. And I do not want to get into this debate, but it is good also for the government as a whole to actually look back and consider to show, is there something that can be done so that the common mwananchi can see where their taxes are going into? Because once once the taxpayer can actually see what is happening from the taxes they pay, then it will be an easier debate. We have the laws, then we have the will. And I think it will be easier in that case. But to appeal to someone's morality, I think it's an area we should not depend a lot on. Let's just have a prescriptive system, if we could.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm aware that we've been joined back on stage by our event moderator. So what I'd just like to ask each of you to do is just give maybe a couple of minutes of concluding thoughts on the subject matter that we've discussed so far today. And then we can draw a close to this session and allow the next session to take place. So if we could start at the end with Seth.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me use my time for the conclusion to address, the last topic. Equity and fairness are cardinal principles in taxation. Is there a moral point to it? And in our professions, we do have ethical rules and others. We may quibble with, the word moral, but I'm asking whether the principle of fairness, equity, which requires that everybody pays his fair tax, which is also embedded in progressivity. The more you earn, the more you should pay, has, some moral elements. I think this is, we shouldn't forget that taxation is not just about efficiency of tax collection, but it's also about, fairness, and it's about, equity, which are, sound, tax principles from our basic economics, from Adam Smith and others. Let me also, state that quickly that the issue of avoidance and evasion is becoming narrower. What is the difference in shaming multinational corporations in advanced countries, even if they do not admit guilt, paying more taxes? And I think this is something for, both tax administrators and taxpayers, that for as long as you are beginning to have civil society organizations becoming very, very vigilant in tax activities, they would always take a moral, view to taxation. They would take a fairness. And I think many of us, and I believe that we would have some reflections of some of this in some of our discussions. So the dimensions of tax administration itself, and the involvement of civil society, of the community and others, is what is forcing, some of these issues. So we need to look at the issue, from this dimension. But certainly, let me come back to my point that Africa should build capacity. It's very important that we build capacity in our revenue administrations and other institutions to be able to confront some of these complex issues, that are coming up.
Thank you. I think this whole question of morality is going to continue to take centerpiece in this area of evasion and avoidance. And I would agree with Emily that moral responsibility is different from person to person. But what is key, and I think one of the things that pushes people as well to comply with tax laws and to pay their fair share of tax, which I believe they should, is that where is that tax revenue being used? And I think that is the big issue today. And one of the reasons why individuals are also looking at ways of shifting their portfolios offshore is that they're not convinced that revenues are being used for what they should be used for. I mean, the very basic example, if you look at, northwestern Europe, you have a snowfall, people still get to work tomorrow morning because the roads are cleared at night using taxpayer dollars. We have 2 hours of rain in Nairobi, the whole city comes to a standstill. So are we using our tax revenues correctly? And I think that is going to drive the morality issue and is definitely going to take away the avoidance side of it, and the focus will then move to the evasion side rather than the legal. I think that's where we're headed now.
Thank you. I can't agree more with what Nikhila said. I think that is important. What we are seeing going forward, obviously, when we are talking about changing legislation, we are talking about stakeholder engagement. So this is open. So how we do it is that now there's a legal requirement so that stakeholders are engaged. And so more often we ask people to come out and we have this conversation with regards to the law, because when we have good laws in place, we think that will help in terms of pushing voluntary compliance. So that is in place. When we're engaging, we want to engage in a very transparent and open manner so that you can be able to be seeing things from the same page. Just the last one is that I want to confirm we are engaged with ATAF, and ATAF is playing a role in capacity building, and so I think that is important. We engage, we offer our people for resource, and also we get support from them. And the final one is on advanced pricing arrangements. We have been thinking about it, but we thought that we want to start crawling very well before we run. And so we want to ensure that there's good information, there's good capacity, then we can then be able to engage at that next level on advanced pricing arrangements. But it is within our minds. Thank you.
Thank you. Just my thoughts on this are that I think Africa has come a very big way, and I believe we have a lot to celebrate about how far we've come. We still have a long way to go, but I think we should look at this and focus that it's possible to do all these things. If we have come this far, then we can still make it. And I do not want to repeat all the rest I've said, but as I said earlier, it's important to have laws that enable taxation. So we should have proper laws in place, proper institutions, proper processes and systems to ensure that the whole process runs smoothly. And an issue that we did not touch upon, I think, maybe will be touched upon in another session, but, and I do not wish to, I'm not advertising myself, but where we sit from IBFD, we can access a lot of tax information from all countries in the world. So I think this is an important resource for the tax authority and anyone else who wants to know the tax system of another country. This will help tax authorities especially to know then what is happening in another jurisdiction that you might not necessarily have information locally. So the tax systems of those other jurisdictions, you can get them from us. I'm aware that the Revenue Authority and the Ministry of Finance already have access to this database, and I would like to encourage them to make use of them. There's also a lot of capacity building that the IBFD does in Africa. And I just wanted to repeat that this is something that we will be continuing. And we hope, as I say, there is hope for Africa, there is hope for Kenya. We've come this far and we're going to get far. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And on that very positive note, we end the session. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. That was a wonderful session. Let's put our hands together again in recognition of that. Just a reminder, as per the program, you've seen that we've been discussing the transfer pricing and illicit financial flows, a discussion that went on and into very, very interesting areas, including the morality of the issue of tax paying. And I was very interested to hear what Seth, the former Minister for Finance of Ghana, would say on the same. But what you clearly saw is consensus on the part of the panelists on the need for equity and fairness in the payment of taxes. We are running slightly behind schedule, so we will manage time where we can, especially on the issue of the break. We're going to take a very, very short coffee break, about 10 minutes, and we should be here at exactly 20 past to begin the second session, which is about optimizing big data and advanced analytics for enhanced tax administration. Tea and coffee is served outside to the right. Please, let's do that in 10 minutes flat, and we come back again for the second session. Enjoy your break. 10 minutes only, please.
We are third tax summit in collaboration with the Africa Tax Dialogue. This year it is different from the previous years because we are now holding a Pan-African event in collaboration with our partners who have been organizing the Africa Tax Dialogue. As you know, tax administration and the challenges of tax administration are changing worldwide. There is a move towards data-based decision-making. There is more use of knowledge. So therefore, knowledge-based systems and processes are gaining prominence. And as the world goes towards digitization of the use of technology, it is very important that we also have a discussion, a dialogue with various entities of the society, including industry. A golden opportunity not only for Kenya and not only for Kenya Revenue Authority, but for the entire Africa, to be able to have a session like this, where we're going to have discussions around various thematic areas and also master classes in the last day. Some of the key areas of discussions will be on advanced data analytics. I previously mentioned that technology is going to play a big role in tax administration as we go forward. So therefore, to be able as well. So the whole issue is to be able to share, create a platform where people are able to share knowledge and information, to exchange ideas and insights and experiences, so that you're able to learn from other jurisdictions, but also from other institutions within the country. There are areas in which KRA is very strong. We've been able to implement a number of technology-based systems. Nonetheless, it's very important to be able to engage the taxpayers, the citizens, and experts from different countries and also from within the country. Apart from that, it is to be able to create thought leadership in tax administration, to be able to position Kenya Revenue Authority and the country as thought leader in the area of tax administration, so that we're able to learn from those who are ahead of us in terms of implementing projects and programs, in terms of transforming tax administration. And similarly, it is also an opportunity for those who have not yet advanced in terms of implementation to be able to learn from us. Hopefully, the areas of discussions and the reports will also form as a basis for knowledge management, where we are able to codify the knowledge and insights and information that is gained. We've been able to implement the kind of recommendations that came up in the last tax summit, some of which have found themselves in the current attempt to review or to overhaul the Income Tax Act. So similarly, we are hoping that once the thematic areas are discussed, we discuss issues of digitization and technology-driven processes, the issue of data being a basis for compliance. Once we, as mentioned, we discuss transfer pricing and illicit financial flows, resource mobilization in the counties, issues of extractive industry. We are hoping that there will be specific and actionable recommendations that will come out of this to be able to inform a policy. And I would like to take the opportunity to welcome all of those who have got time to come and attend the summit. As mentioned, we are happy to have our partners, the organizers of the Africa Tax Dialogue, and also to appreciate all our sponsors who have been able to make it possible. We don't take it for granted. We also want to appreciate those who have come to attend the summit, to be able to take information and also contribute, because after the panel discussions, there will be an opportunity for people to ask questions, give comments, or seek clarifications. So in totality, ours is that at the end of the summit, we will be better informed as stakeholders, we will be better informed as the tax administrators and other colleagues who will be able to contribute. So in this third tax summit, we hope that we'll be able to recommend even to implement even more recommendations. We're hoping that this will be entrenched in the calendar, so that we're able to make sure that we are having a more comprehensive tax summit progressively every single year, and the end result hopefully will be a better and enhanced tax base, a better methods and methodologies for taxing the informal sector, the micro enterprises, and the oil and gas sector as well. So I wish to welcome everybody, and I hope you'll have a very fruitful discussion, and at the end of the summit, you will have benefited, as well as we are hoping that we'll benefit. Thank you very much.
Check. Yeah. Yeah. Check.
Services to Kenya Revenue Authority customers, and this has been achieved through integration of national bank systems and KRA systems. And through this integration, we are able to offer real-time payments and reporting into the KRA systems, so that once our customers make payments at any of our national bank outlets, then the same is reflected automatically into KRA systems. This ensures that by the time the customer leaves our banking halls or completes the transaction through our online systems, their records at KRA are fully updated, therefore a seamless service in an efficient and effective manner. The bank has invested in systems, solutions and manpower to provide an end-to-end platform on which KRA customers are able to make their tax payments at any National Bank of Kenya outlet countrywide. Just as our Bank on Better slogan states, National Bank of Kenya prides itself in provision of cutting-edge and value-adding financial solutions to customers. Our partnership with KRA shows the importance of collaboration to achieve a common goal. This partnership has enabled National Bank of Kenya to be the preferred tax payment partner for KRA customers. Currently, the bank collects 70% of all taxes across our various outlets countrywide. And to also demonstrate our commitment to KRA, we have rolled out strategic banking halls and tax collection points in key commercial areas, ports of entry, and border points to ensure that Kenya Revenue Authority meets its objectives to facilitate the nation-building call.
Kenya, mkona motisha ya kusonga mbele. You're reaching higher heights, and you are the reason. You are the here's to living out your dreams. You can be all you can. Kenya inasonga mbele.
wetu. You are the reason. Tulipe ushuru, tujitegemee.
Naona baraka, naomba fanaka, natia bidii, naimarisha hustle yangu. Oh, Kenya ni yangu, naipenda nchi yangu, nitaijenga nchi yangu, najivunia kuwa Mkenya. Mimi Mkenya. Mimi Mkenya. Mimi Mkenya. Mimi Mkenya, Mkenya mtu.
Mkenya mtu hulipa ushuru. Tulipe ushuru, tujitegemee.
And next, my pleasure to introduce panelist Beatrice Gishoi, who is Acting Deputy Commissioner at the Kenya Revenue Authority, KRA. There she is. Let's welcome her. Do we have Mr. Richard Bade? Right there. He is a former Commissioner General for the Tanzania Revenue Authority. Let's clap for him. Last and not least, we do have Sebu Hailelul, who is the Country Manager for Microsoft Kenya. Sebu. Sebu will also be our moderator for this session, but that is only after the keynote address and keynote presentation, which will be made by Nick Nesbitt, MD, IBM. Let's put our hands together again for Nick as he comes to present. Oh, my apologies. We've just left Raul Flores, who is the Digital Advisor on Tax Administration. Please wave. Yes. So that's our big panel. We'll be discussing optimizing big data and advanced analytics for enhanced tax administration. But before that, a keynote presentation by Nick Nesbitt. Nick. Floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Linus. And good morning, everybody. And good morning, fellow panelists. So this morning, I just want to take a few minutes to share a few things with you. First, I want to dare you to imagine what it could be like if the authorities locally in Kenya were able to collect, administer, and demonstrate that they had collected the right amount of taxes from everybody, and what that whole experience would look like. Secondly, I want to talk about the journey and what it will take to go from where we are to where we could be. And I will do that by sharing a few examples that IBM has implemented and demonstrated and has references for revenue authorities in different parts of the world. By way of history, if you have followed IBM over the last 100 and almost 10 years or so, it's always been about analytics, first around weighing scales, that's where it started. But when it got into the computing business, the first customer was actually the Census Bureau in the United States, and they wanted a computer. Why did they want the computer? For tax collection. The history of IBM has really been around tax collection and financial services. So when we're talking here, we're talking about an area in which we have extreme familiarity over many, many years. So what are the problems that KRA faces? What are the problems that most tax authorities face? Pick anywhere on the circle. If you look at the top, it's getting more and more complicated in terms of the regulations, the challenges around compliance, and the number of forms one has to fill, or the number of points where you get a point of tax collection. And all of that is being designed, whether a big picture or reactively, by tax authorities and by governments to increase the amount of taxation. So that's a big challenge. Secondly, there's a whole problem around the experience. As it becomes more and more complicated, it's no longer about just filling out one form, but it gets more and more challenging. Multiple forms, you go online, it doesn't work very well. I have my own personal experiences on that. And that also hinders tax collection. But the third area that's becoming increasingly challenging is around fraud. And fraud has always been around. It's always been around with tax collection for thousands of years, giving unto Rome what is due. But as criminals become more sophisticated, they're able to manipulate financial systems and their own businesses to ensure that they don't pay the taxes that they should. So this vicious cycle that, let's say, KRA, but I can also speak for the rest of the RAs in East Africa, is the problem statement. This is the problem statement. How do you break this vicious cycle and ensure that you have much more positive impact going forward? And we would say, not just because we were invited to say that today, but we would say the answer is around data. The answer can be found in the data. The answer can be found in the insights that you get from the data. We all know about structured data, without really perhaps thinking about that name. That's the data that you find in spreadsheets, in databases. It's the data that is structured. There's a huge amount of unstructured data, primarily, let's call it social media. That's just exploding, and you've all seen the charts on that. Vast amounts of information in social media. Vast amounts of information about people buying a brand new Prado, brand new VX, or brand new Range Rover Sport, yet they're only filing taxes to the tune of $500,000 a year. How's that possible? So, huge amounts of information on social media about companies and about individuals, but the problem is a problem of integration. The data is not integrated. And because it's not integrated, it's very difficult to get insights, in particular, actionable insights. So the challenge that people face today is how do you bring all that data together and create the insights? And I know that KRA is automating and is automating aggressively, but there's a long way to go, I would say, between where they are and where they could be. But the route is possible, because all the technology that might work in, pick it, Sweden or America or in Australia, if you bring it to Kenya and you plug it in and you look after it well, it can do exactly the same things. So, data. The question that we were also asked was to talk about artificial intelligence. So today, the systems that KRA have allow them to look at data and allow them to analyze, and we can see how it's becoming more sophisticated. With further enhancement to bring in the unstructured data, you can now start to generate more information about the individuals and the companies. If you're really going after fraud, you then want to start looking at patterns. The most valuable insights come from patterns, come from relationships, come from themes, but most importantly, come from people who are not following a pattern. And using your own brain, it's very difficult to spot anomalies. You can do it on very simple pictures that appear in the newspapers or in cartoon books, but when you're looking at vast amount of data, you can no longer do it with a human mind. So you have to be able to identify the patterns first, find anomalies, and then be able to determine how do you go after those anomalies. And if you do this enough, people get better and better about it. But to really get better, we say you need artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence takes you from analyzing historical data to analyzing, call it current and future data, which is where you want to go to next. But then artificial intelligence takes it one step further, which is making sense out of the future data based on the historical and putting it all together. And the machine learning, and it gets smarter and smarter. And when we get to the point of artificial intelligence here, off we go on this journey. But this problem that we have to solve cannot only be about the machines working in the background. We also have to change the citizen experience, the customer experience. For me, I have not been able to pay my 2006 taxes because I use a Mac. And I'm being told I have to use an Intel machine to be able to use that application that they use. And no matter how many times I call the call center, I can't actually call it. I have to send an email. They keep giving me other instructions. The citizen experience is terrible. I haven't been able to pay the taxes, which I don't actually have to pay, but more importantly, I haven't been able to pay the fines, and it's something like 20,000 bob a month. So I'm going to have to charge KRA for these fines I have to pay. So it's very, very difficult, and if the customer experience is challenging, people delay in paying taxes, which means revenue does not get collected. What if you could use artificial intelligence and you could have a bot? A bot is really an automated robot. It's a technology robot that could actually tell who people are and who Nick is. And, whoa, the guy hasn't paid, so when I start accessing the call center, I'm actually talking to a bot, and you can't even tell the difference. And you can enhance the experience. And that's a small example of the many things that need to happen to change the whole experience. Now, going back to the fraud, we have a case in Europe where we worked with a tax authority who was really challenged by the sense that they knew that there was fraud and they knew they were not catching the criminals. And one example in particular here was a European tax authority who knew that there was VAT fraud going on, and they could identify one individual who was setting up dummy companies. Then each of those companies was invoicing another dummy company for VAT, and then turning around to the tax authority for a VAT refund and getting paid. And they could see millions of dollars coming out. And this person was very clever because they're working all over the EU, not just in one country. So no sooner would they start a company, get the VAT refund, they would close it, they would disappear. And they couldn't catch this person. So that's when they came to IBM. So we were able to put in tools. What you see there in that map is an application we have, which the police use, Safaricom uses, lots of people use, I think even KRA uses, which shows you linkages between different people. And the gentleman who was starting this fraud, when you started to look at transactions, cash flow transactions between individuals, and you put it on a map, you could start to see that this person appeared in many places behind these companies. They collected the data from the tax authorities in a spreadsheet format, which is very good, name, email, whatever, PIN of the different companies, put it together, connect them. They said, wow, there's one guy at the center of this. And they were able to do that literally within hours. Literally within hours. And they could actually catch him red-handed because they could watch what was happening with transactions. That technology, plug it in here, it works. Another example in California, the California, they call it the franchise tax collection, franchise, whatever it's called, had 3 million customers who were not paying taxes. And they didn't know how to get them. And as you can imagine, they have massive departments that go after people who don't pay. Their problem is that it's really finessing the amount of collection because everybody's part of the tax system. It's very much more advanced here than here that we know. So they were able again to look at the historical data. They had predictive applications that allowed them to see who was going to not pay their taxes going forward, based again on patterns and looking at analysis and so on. The important thing about this was that they were then able to prioritize the work of the tax collectors, because with 3 million customers, where do you start? You can probably start saying, oh, I saw this customer in the newspaper, but this one I've never seen, let me go for this one. But really, when you look at the data, it's actually reversed. So they were able to go after the large non-filers, understand whether they were successful at collecting from who the computer said, feed it back into the system, make it smarter, and then after that, they could really refine who they went after. The net result was they were able to collect over $400 million in the space of 2 years from start to finish, and improved non-filers by over 300%. Again, just using technology. Again, technology that works in this part of the world. So when you talk about what the future could look like from an experience standpoint, before I finish here, anytime, anywhere access to your tax records and your tax engagement with the tax authorities. I should be able on my phone to see what I owe KRA, when the filings are, when I should be able to get alerts. I should have an app. It shouldn't be a surprise. In the old days, when credit cards first came out, even when bank statements came out electronically in paper, you used to sit there forever just going through it until eventually you learned how to trust, at the time, Citibank's credit card. And eventually you trust everybody. And when you see your credit card statement, that kind of looks good. Paying tax is such a taxing process now. We must think of how to make it easier to encourage compliance and encourage payments. Likewise, I mentioned the bots. What kind of electronic agents can you have that can help you? How can this be interactive? And how can it be, most importantly, personalized? All of those are answerable, and all of those are doable. But it's a journey. Always start with the end in mind. What do we want the experience to look like? With those two organizations we talked about in Europe and in the States, we started here. Using design thinking, so that would mean in this case, 10, 20, 60 people from KRA sitting in a design thinking course, reimagining the future and the experience. And I promise you, by the time you get to the end, what you thought about